And thank you very much. And it's really lovely to be here. Really enjoyed the conversations at lunch and the conversations yesterday. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Research takes many shapes and forms and is conducted across a range of institutions, from multi-faculty universities to independent research organizations. And yet many discussions about research practices and research cultures revolve almost exclusively around the model of the large multi-faculty university. Today, I want to focus on institutions that fall between the gaps, that don't fit into the multi-faculty structure, but still play a vital role in the UK university system. And my focus is going to be on small and specialist institutions. Now, what, you may ask, is a small specialist institution? Good question, and one that is difficult to answer because there isn't a standardized definition. More on that shortly. Across Europe, there are often universities of the arts that bring together specialist training in dance, music, drama, filmmaking, media, fine arts, design. The UK does have a number of these institutions. Of course, the University of the Arts London is the largest of these, made up of a series of different colleges and schools that were once separate institutions, including Central St Martin's School of Art, London College of Communication, and the London School of Fashion. Small arts universities exist. Bournemouth Arts University and the University for the Creative Arts are two such institutions with a focus on creative arts education across different fields, including gaming and the visual and performing arts. In addition, however, there are also institutions such as mine, small specialists or monotechnics, as they're also known, with a much smaller student intake and single or dual subject provision. For the purpose of my discussion today, I won't be dealing with the fine art or visual art schools or colleges. Anne would be far more equipped to talk about those than I, but of the institutions that once identified as conservatoires, involved in specialist music, drama, or dance training. Although I would argue that some of the characteristics I'm going to be discussing are equally applicable to other small specialist institutions, the Royal Agricultural University, the Royal Veterinary College, the Institute for Cancer Research, who operate at a not dissimilar scale. Edward Venning offers a series of useful reflections on small specialist higher education providers in a report authored for the Higher Education Policy Institute earlier this year. In Size is Everything, what small specialist and practice-based providers tell us about the higher education sector, Venning defines a teaching institution as small if it has under 3,000 students. The University of the Arts London, or UAL, has over 21,000 students, and yet it is still spoken of in the same cluster of organisations that are a fraction of its size, like my own, the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. UAL may be a specialist provider, but it's not small. The Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, henceforth Central, is both small and specialist. We have about 1,000 students, which sits in the figure of 500 to 1,200, which is where many of the small specialist institutions lie. So the National Film and Television School, for example, has 500 students. The Guildhall School of Music and Drama has 1,000. The Royal College of Music has 900. Venning points out the lack of definitional clarity and consistency in policy relating to small specialist institutions. And he uses an Office for Students. Office for Students is a body here in the UK that is responsible, a regulator that's responsible for teaching in universities. He uses that definition provided by them, that, and I quote from the Office for Students, that to be considered specialist, a provider must have at least 75% of its total full-time equivalent higher education and further education student population in one broad subject area, or at least 90% in no more than two. End quote. So small and specialist providers may not be very visible on one level, but as Venning observes, they make up a considerable proportion of the sector in England, anywhere up to about 23% of registered Office for Students providers. So 23%, but largely invisible. Venning notes references to small specialist providers in policy documents. So, for example, often in ways that recognise that their teaching is distinguished by specialist training for industry and high contact hours, and that it represents a unique part of the higher education ecology and needs to be protected. So proximity to industry with a significant proportion or percentage of fractional staff who continue to work in industry, in our case in the creative arts, is a key part of their ethos. Venning suggests that the medical schools, veterinary colleges, creative and performing arts schools, and agricultural colleges that constitute the small specialist sector are distinguished by practice, a form of teaching and learning where doing is at the core. But I would argue that it isn't just practice per se that distinguishes them. Practice is present in the large medical schools at Oxford or Cambridge, for example, or in creative arts subjects in large multi-faculty institutions also. Colleagues from the University of Middlesex are speaking this afternoon. Rather, I would say it's the limited size and scale that marks us out. For the focus on one or two disciplines offers only limited scope for flexible responses to problems of resource and demand, and this has implications for research. A recognition of different types of higher education institutions is a matter of diversity and inclusion, and ensuring that this is recognised in policies and guidance is key to equality of opportunity. While I've chosen to begin with some of the challenges that come in defining the kind of higher education provider that I work at, and the invisibility of providers like my own in a higher education sector where big is often seen as best, I would argue that one of the strengths of the UK research system is the fact that research takes place across multiple areas and sectors. I began this presentation talking about small specialists, and despite the fact that we're often positioned alongside post-1992 universities as teaching intensives, as opposed to the Russell Group institutions that are labelled research intensives, I would argue that research takes place across the breadth of higher education sector in this country, as well as in industry, in government, and across what are labelled independent research organisations. And independent research organisations are largely heritage bodies, museums, libraries, archives, theatre companies, as with the National Archives, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Library, the Royal Shakespeare Company, among others, deemed by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to have a large enough critical mass to be considered for Research Council funding. Much of the guidance produced in relation to research is fashioned with large multi-faculty higher education institutions in mind. So it's not easy for bodies that don't fit that size and shape to see what fostering excellence might look like, or how they adhere to sector guidance that relegates their kind of institution to a footnote. My institution has submitted to research assessment exercises since 1996 and remains committed to an understanding of creative arts practice with research at the core. And yet I'm consistently surprised when people ask me, "You do research? Well, what does that involve?" Well, it involves a series of things. The cultivation of a supportive research environment, and one that recognises the different paths that have led researchers to positions in higher education. One that recognises the economy of scale that we operate at, that might not allow us to buy into services provided by bodies like, for example, the UK's Research Integrity Office. One that recognises making and doing that underpins much of our research, and one that recognises that research integrity is at the core of all research, whatever its scope and scale. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be looking at what it means to centre research integrity at the core of our research culture, and secondly, how our practices of research have been manifest through our practice research. And here I'm using the definition provided by James Bully and Sahin Osden in their practice research reports, which are downloadable from the British Library. And I quote, practice research, an umbrella term that describes all manners of research where the practice is the significant method of research conveyed in a research output. This includes numerous discipline-specific formulations of practice research, which have distinct and unique balances of practice, research narrative, and complementary methods within their projects, end quote. So by examining some of the challenges involved in supporting research within a small specialist, I want to provide examples of how we've sought to promote research practices with inclusivity at the core. And I use we here in a very conscious way because a commitment to change has come from across the research base. And this includes performance makers coming from industry, some with a PhD, some without, but all engaged to some degree or other with practice, either through the research they undertake as theatre makers, dramaturgs, curators, or through rehearsal ethnography, so observing the rehearsal or making process, or collaborations with practitioners through interviews or through a focus on theatre's materiality, its status as an art form with participation at its core, or its application in different social and educational contexts. And my presentation benefits from the input of a number of colleagues at Central at different career stages, including previous and current chairs of our Ethics and Integrity Committee, an ECR, an early career researcher with responsibility for promoting integrity in their workload allocation, and two further postdoctoral fellows, one with a permanent position at another Russell Group University in London, and another one who is now a permanent member of staff at Central, as well as staff from research services. So research environments evolve as staff come and go, as new projects are developed, new collaborations are developed, and research moves in different directions. And evolution is key. The open research agenda, the increasing recognition of the importance of integrity, the heightened awareness of equality and inclusion, all of these are shaping how researchers and institutions think about the conduct of research. And the academic base of an institution like Central, as with many other small specialists, involves lots of staff who have come from industry. Some of them undertake professional practice that is not research-led, or forms of research that can be seen as more traditional in terms of being based in arts and humanities archival practices. But I would argue that whether it's research-led practice or not, all the staff feed into a research environment because we know that the relationship between knowledge exchange, research, and impact is very porous. And I think an understanding of why issues of integrity, honesty, rigor, transparency, and open communication, care, respect, accountability are relevant, not just to research, but also to public engagement and to knowledge exchange. I would argue that key here has been the fostering of what I see as a transparent research environment. So, for example, we introduced an Ethics and Integrity Committee in 2016. And this allowed for a much more robust discussion of the relationship between ethics and integrity, embedding training across the research base, and also to those delivering teaching where students are undertaking research-led practice or a lot of participatory practice. And I think it's really helped in terms of practitioners embedding ethical issues into their ways of doing or asking a new set of questions about how they do. And we have on our Research and Ethics Committee, members of staff who are not researchers, but who are involved, for example, in intimacy training in the rehearsal room or in health and safety, in design and technical work, bringing those perspectives into the work of the Ethics and Integrity Committee. There's only about 80 academic staff in our institution, and that means that information can circulate quite easily and filter through the institution. And each year we have a session for all staff looking at how issues of ethics and integrity are really shaping work in the creative arts. So the discussions of integrity have become part of the fabric of what we do. And I'm going to quote here from the former chair of our Ethics and Integrity Committee, when they say, at the root of ethics is care, and that's made for a more careful ethics culture, providing an opportunity to shape ethics in a way that better suits the art forms in which we work, not a system predicated on science or sociological foundations, but nevertheless committed to the Concordat to support research integrity principles. It's allowed us a fit-for-purpose process for ethical consideration, a process that's both robust and quick to respond. End quote. So I would argue that the kinds of questions that the Ethics and Integrity Committee have been engaging with have shaped all our work at Central. For example, how do you ask a question at a conference? Are you gatekeeping? Are you intervening when you witness unethical behavior? Care and respect as fundamental to the ways we treat each other. That feels fundamental. We've also built an integrity role into an early career researchers' workload to ensure that the voices of early career researchers are at the core of decision making. And this person has talked about the opportunities this has offered. I'm constantly learning, he said, and developing my own ethical praxis, gaining a wider understanding of ethics in research more generally. And it allows me to highlight the particular needs of early career researchers. I think these things have made a difference. A distributed and delegated leadership in bringing ECRs into that decision making, allowing ECRs and senior research leaders to work together. Maybe this is something facilitated by our type of scale. One ECR talks about the benefit of having joined committees, working groups, interview panels, funding review panels for the British Academy, which gave me an insight, they say, into decision-making and how a research environment is built. I'm not sure I would have had those opportunities at a bigger institution. Training, I would also argue, has been part of that picture, allowing staff to think about their role and agency within a wider research environment. Researchers often might not know the nuances of policy documents or concordats. We have a lot of concordats here in the UK, or feel that they have time to read them. They do overlap, they duplicate information. But I think one of the things that training has allowed is for the principles of those concordats to be part of the lived experience of the institution. You can aim higher, one ECR mentioned, when you know there are people with the capacity and expertise to support you. Another issue is around time built into the workload allocation for not just for research, but for the management of research and the wider institutional and disciplinary research activities that form part of a research ecology. For example, roles on subject associations, peer reviews, editing, civic work. Mistakes are more likely to be made when research is undertaken in a rushed manner. Transparent forms of funding for research, a very transparent sabbatical process with guidance and criteria written in plain English and checked by neurodivergent researchers has been key here. It allows us to buy researchers out for grant applications, completion of outputs, support for building partnerships to support collaborative research collaborations. All of these have helped build a more inclusive and I would argue impactful research culture where projects are co-designed with participants outside the higher education sector and also allowing for a greater degree of accountability. You know what you need to deliver because you've laid it out in the application. I would argue that those initiatives have helped build morale, and they've offered the time for people to put forward applications that they feel confident about. We've also recognised the labour involved in supporting research through subject associations, editorial roles, and we offer financial support to those willing and able to take on those roles. So it allows a broader cross-section of staff to take on these roles. The work in supporting research, civic work, cannot and should not remain invisible. It's key to the effective operation of peer review, to disciplinary development, to interdisciplinary collaborations, to the allocation of funding. All of these things are core to the practice of research. About 24% of our researchers are neurodivergent, and I've worked with our neuroinclusion and disability service to ensure reasonable adjustment and an understanding of what that means for different researchers. It takes different shapes and forms. The current chair of our Ethics and Integrity Committee is neurodivergent, and she writes of this as leveling the playing field between researchers. Support in the form of proofreading and copy editing was useful, but the weekly support sessions from a trained specialist has proved invaluable. Since receiving this support 5 years ago, I've published 1 monograph, 1 co-edited book, 2 journal articles, and 7 book chapters, and become the co-editor of a leading journal, as well as submitting 2 grant applications. Without this support, in the previous 3 years, I wrote 1 journal article. So what she identifies as a nuanced response to individual researchers and their needs and circumstances that understands that a diverse research team has different requirements and adjustments, a genuine understanding that research incorporates a variety of styles and approaches is key. Supporting researchers in ways that understand their needs is a matter of integrity and institutional accountability. 1ECR writes of the work to create a research culture always needing an understanding of the diverse needs of researchers from different backgrounds and disciplines, and responding to those needs while holding researchers accountable to wider processes. This is reflected in the wider national conversation, where a national research culture, international research culture, is only effective when it's sensitive to the needs of diverse research topics, methods, and structures across the research sector. And this, I would argue, is particularly important when you're thinking about small specialists. So I want to map a few of the challenges, in creating an accountable research environment. And what happens when things go wrong? People are often talking about successes. I want to talk about failures, because research is often about failures, about things, the way we manage things when they don't go the way we might have expected them. The drive to achieve success, I think, is often problematic. Problematic because it can lead to less than ideal practices, because the performance of punishment in our university context can be very public and very brutal, especially in the world of social media. Research, I would argue, is slow. It takes time. We're still feeling the effects of COVID. They've affected certain researchers, those with caring responsibilities, those navigating health conditions disproportionately. And there needs to be an understanding in our sector that research experiments fail. Arguments may not come together the way we may wish. We get things wrong, and we need to learn from this. We need to share those lessons learned with others. This has to be part of a healthy research culture. I increasingly talk about slow research that needs time, research where time is built in to check and check again. I would argue also that research, as well as time, needs resources. We often think about the resources for research as being based in a research office, a research department, but it's there in our human resources departments. It's there in our finance departments. If people are not paid on time, by a finance department, that could have implications on how the research is conducted. If contracts are not issued on time, it can affect how participants may feel that they've been marginalized by a research project. So research involving time and resources, but also accountability from within the whole institution, rather than just a research office or department. At times also, when things don't go the way you want, you might need to bring in people from outside to help resolve things. This is very important in a small specialist institution where you don't have a critical mass of staff. I brought in people to help resolve disputes, to assist with training and mentoring, to support staff when things go wrong, to help manage an investigation of research misconduct or a grievance. In a presentation to a Research Culture and Practice Forum in June of this year, Rachel Passad, the Research Policy Officer for Guild HE is a representative body alongside UK for the higher education sector here in Britain. And it represents subject areas including art, design, media, but also law, health and sports. She articulated the challenges really well, and I quote, "To support the research environment, there will be stark choices to be made, realizing that small support teams and minimal budgets will affect the fact that you won't be able to spend on expensive proprietary software. Institutions may find alternatives, mentoring models, distributed leadership, learning moments involving the whole academic community in discussions about the implementing of integrity principles. Monotechnics have unrivaled experience and deep understanding of these issues, and they lead the way in taking a laser focus on the integrity issues that pertain to that discipline. It's useful for others, and we at Guild HE have been active in putting those into the wider sector via the UK Research Integrity Office and signatories work." Before I finish, I want to very briefly end with a few reflections on practice research as on the practice of research as refracted through the practice research that we undertake. In many ways, the debates around practice research have often focused on unpicking the terminology: practice as research, practice-led research, practice-based research. It's been the practice element that's bothered us. But I found that a consideration of the research element has been key in our work at Central. And at the end, there's a video, we'll circulate the slides, and there's a video where you can see some of the work that we've been doing in this area. And part of it has been about the visibility for the findings of practice research. And Anne was talking a little bit about this in the introduction. We use a very clear definition of research, and you could use that of the Frascati manual. We use the one provided by Research England, which is the body that funds and engages with higher education institutions in the UK to help create and sustain a healthy research culture. As a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. So the focus on a process of research, a series of questions, an inquiry, leading to new findings or knowledge, the insights, which are then placed in the public domain, effectively shared. And effective dissemination and sharing has been a real challenge, I think, with practice research. With monographs, edited collections, you've got the book that goes into the public domain. Articles, of course, have the Web of Science, citation indexes, a mechanism of different search engines, and very powerful publishers like Reed Elsevier, Sage, Springer, Taylor and Francis, Wiley, Blackwell, which ensure a real visibility for their products. That's very different in practice research, where there isn't, you do have the institutional repositories, but there isn't a place where practice research lies, so to speak. There isn't a repository, an international repository or searchable series of sites for practice research. And we don't have persistent identifiers like DOIs for practice research. So there's no consistent way of referencing in university repositories. And that's a challenge, I think. And I think it hasn't helped with visibility. I want to just very, very briefly look at some of the outputs provided for the REF exercise in 2021, the Research Assessment Exercise. And you can see there that in some of the science and medical panels, so in the medical panels, the allied disciplines and health, 99.69% of the outputs were articles. I mean, that's a massive, massive proportion. In the arts and humanities main panel, that was just 40.26%. So that already gives you an idea that there's lots of different diverse forms of disseminating. You've got some statistics there on engineering versus the music, drama, dance, performing arts, film and screen studies subpanel that I chaired. But one of the things those statistics will show you, and I won't go through them, is how many different types of outputs there were that came from practice research. So digital and visual media, multi-channel work, performances, recordings, scores. We only had 30% of our outputs as articles, and 27.11% of the outputs were some sort of practice research. So that gives you an indication that it may not be very visible, but it's a really important part of the research ecology. As I said, there's a video at the end that you can watch in your own time around this, which shows some of those approaches that we've used. But I think that I think one of the challenges for us as a field is how we can create an interoperable system that allows for practice research to be identifiable and therefore searchable. And I think that that's a really important part of the challenges that we have, not just as small specialists, but within the creative arts sector and the research sector moving forward. To end, the diversity of institutions in higher education, the diversity of a researcher base, the diversity of modes through which research can be disseminated. This is all related to inclusivity. They're all connected. It's about displacing the I and thinking about the complex we, the complex community that makes up our institutions. And ensuring that the work that we do, whether it's in a small specialist institution or in a large multi-faculty institution, can help to create systems that, and I'm quoting from the Frascati manual now, increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of humankind, culture, and society. So finding ways in which, through the work we do, we can work productively, ethically, responsibly to create modes of nurturing and disseminating research, articulating the benefits of our findings, so that they can circulate beyond the creative environment where the research may have initially been conducted in ways that demonstrate the value of what we do to the higher education sector, the creative industries, and the wider body of audiences and users who engage with the creative work we undertake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes, I think. We've got exactly 7 minutes for questions. So Matthew's going to do the running around. This I obviously can't. At least I'm a bit slow. But has anybody got any questions they want to ask? Oh, there's a question down here.
Hi, Maria. I'm actually in the applied linguistic field. So we're kind of similar in a way that, we kind of like specific disciplines. I think it is actually wonderful, to hear from you about, the success, stories about, inclusivity. But I find that from my experience that our university is actually kind of like having an agenda on certain niche, like certain topics. So for example, if your research falls into like one of the niche areas, or thing that is going to bring glory to the university, well, actually department rather, because our university is applied linguistics is not a niche in our in my university. So I find that it's a bit difficult, because you're not in a power position and you have research, that you've been doing back in the days when you were doing your PhD, and you find that you're running into problem because you have to really change yourself, to fit in the system. What do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the benefits of being at a small specialist institution where all we do is theatre, design, performance, applied and social theatre is we're not fighting with other bits of the university for visibility. When I worked at a large multi-faculty, I always felt I had to make the case against, the historians or the English department or, the law department, business administration, the physicists. And, that's one of the benefits. This is what we do. And often people will come to us for interdisciplinary projects because they're aware of our results, or they've seen aspects of one of our projects. It's made the media or the news, or they've read about it. We collaborate with medics on work around patient care in the NHS, so they might come across it through being featured in Nature or in a science journal, and they'll come to us for the collaboration. So that's one of the benefits. There are the disadvantages of being in small specialty, but one of the benefits is that that's all we do. So we're not vying to get attention from the powers of the university. In many ways, we are the powers of the university. So that's a really refreshing. That's a really refreshing thing. And we often hear that from people where they are working in our areas or working in other disciplines where it's not that discipline may not be an institutional priority. I think we forget about the value of the arts and humanities at our peril. Linguistics, you've talked about linguistics. Linguistics help us understand the world. If we don't understand linguistic difference, how can we understand where we came from, where language is, where it might be going? And I think often when I'm sitting in fora with my equivalents in large multi-faculty institutions, I'm there not just to talk about the creative arts, but also to talk about the arts and humanities as a way of encouraging us, allowing us, providing us with the tools to better understand the situations we find ourselves in. And I think that's something that often brings us together as scholars it's interesting. You talked about some of the you could identify with some of the areas I talked about. And I think we have an ethical responsibility. It's a matter of integrity, the ways in which we support each other. And certainly here in the UK, the arts and humanities have been battered by this government in ways that they're seen as decorative, not useful. And actually, we forget at our peril that without the arts and humanities, how do we understand where we came from? And if we don't understand that, how can we understand where we are or where we might want to go? Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I've got one. Neela?
You touched upon failures. It's interesting that you touch upon failures, and it's a question about how do you see failures, and do failures have a different scale because the size of the institution matters? And how do we, in any possible way, start talking about failures in bigger spaces without being kind of erased from that conversation?
Yeah. Erased or embarrassed. I think the performance, there's so much public, scrutiny can be so vicious. It can create a great sense of fear, I think, in the higher education sector where you can't own up to failures. I think there are different kinds of failures. But I think so often with research, when things go wrong, it's often perceived as very personal, when I think there can be a lot of institutional reasons why things go wrong. And the punishment can also be very much at a personal level. A claim of misconduct against a person. I think it's often systems that can lead to instances of misconduct. And it's too easy to blame the person. You blame the person, you don't need to look at the system. And I think there are issues around questionable research practices where an error may not be intended, which is very different to a deliberate falsification. And I think that, I think you're absolutely right. There are different levels and different scales. But I think creating a space where you're able to talk about that feels really important. So often early career researchers will say, I felt I couldn't talk about it, or I was too embarrassed. We need to create the kind of spaces where we can own up and say, that I did that and I shouldn't have done it. Can we unpick how I got there to make sure that I don't do it again? And in a system where the focus is on prizes, awards, success, how much have you published often? And I think that promotion processes are changing. So it's less on the quantity and more on the quality, which I think is absolutely as it should be. But it's still a pressure where people, especially coming in, where it's a precarious employment situation, where I think, I need to do more. And it's often when you're in that hurry that some of the mistakes happen. So I think it's not easy, but it's about trying to create the space where those conversations can happen and people not feel afraid of having those conversations. And it's not easy.
Can I just follow that up? Because actually, I had a similar question, but coming at it from somewhere different, which actually, I think you were talking about the difference between errors in research and actually research that didn't work. And I think, this is a call out to everybody, really. I have a fantasy research centre. It's the centre of what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Would be the biggest public service, actually the biggest global service we could ever offer. And the question I wanted to ask you is whether you think it is something that small and specialist, but actually the arts and humanities could offer back. Because actually, I think we're quite good at kind of admitting that we messed up creatively and actually something came out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting place to be. But I'd really like to hear from a small and specialist in a sense, because I think that's the intimate environment in which that could happen.
Funnily enough, Anne, we've often spoken about this ourselves, but with my own colleagues at Central, we talk a lot about, the institute for things that don't go right. And with creative practice, I'll often talk to colleagues where they've just done a production and they'll say, this was wrong and this was wrong and this was wrong and this was wrong. And if I had time, I'd do A, B, and C. Well, they might not have to. They might have time in the productions touring but they might not. But that will go into the next piece of work that they do. And I do think that our willingness to say that didn't quite work is really important. It's about humility, and research must always be about humility, I think. That feels like a really important part of what we do, because that humility also allows critical reflection to be built into the process. So, and I agree. I think I rarely have, I don't think any of our practice researchers talk about successes. When they were doing their practice research submissions, and you can see details of them in that video, they were often saying, no, I do this differently and I do that differently. And I was the one saying to them, well, actually, this was pretty good and that was pretty good, because they were just consistently reflecting on what they would have done different. I think there's a healthy balance.
Yeah.
And that's where I try and be in kind of, ensuring that they're navigating that healthy balance, because I think it's that recognition of what didn't go right, those failings, those errors, those things that didn't work, that propel you into your next piece of work. And that always feels really exciting. I think it's similar with science experiments, that people learn from, and they might then go back to that data set and try something different. And so I think there are parallels, and we've often spoken about, that the medics often really understand the practice research because they're also working through doing.
My worry in it all, and for those of you who use journal rankings and a whole series of other things, is nobody ever publishes that. You very rarely do you ever see a paper where the errors of a £3 million grant are published. And would they score highly in a ranked journal? I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
I'd really like to see it, because actually it would be the biggest global, I seriously think it'd be the biggest global service we could do to stop wasting money on research that's been done and done and done again.
I think it's really interesting. I sit on the UK's Committee for Research Integrity, and the ECR who sits on that committee works in medicine, in cancer research. And she is consistently drawing attention to those things and saying there's a new generation of early career researchers where that's where they're focusing. Because if they share those things that went wrong with a wider community, it will stop a whole series of investment in projects that's throwing money away in an era of limited resources. It's our responsibility to think about globally, not just at a local or national level, but globally, how we are spending that resources, because it's about addressing the key challenges of our time: medical, humanitarian, social,